Whispers of Prehistory, Women Before the Written Word. In the stillness of long-forgotten ages, before uprose and empires fell, women walked quietly beside the slow beat of time. In caves, across plains, and along rivers that no longer run, their presence was essential but silent, woven into the rhythm of early life. There are no journals from these eras, no painted portraits or signed letters. There are only tools, bones, and the markings of hands on cold cave walls. The women of prehistory remain mostly invisible in the archaeological record, yet their influence echoes in every fragment we uncover. These early women gathered roots, herbs, and berries. They knew the behavior of birds and the whisper of the wind before the storm. Some likely helped in hunting, some watched the children, and many understood the mysteries of life and death. The cycle of pregnancy, birth, and motherhood must have been sacred and terrifying, especially without medicine or certainty. Many scholars believe that early spiritual systems may have centered on female figures. Fertility goddesses, round and stylized, appear again and again, like the Venus of Willendorf, carved over 25,000 years ago. She was not a queen or a wife. She was not young or slim. She was fertility itself, wide hips, full breasts, and heavy with meaning. The roles of these women were varied and complex. Some may have been healers, mixing herbs in quiet shadows. Others crafted baskets or wove early textiles from plant fibers. They likely taught children to survive, where to find water, which animals to fear, and how to listen to the land. Their knowledge was passed down through soft voices and gentle repetition. There were no classrooms, only shared wisdom and watchful eyes. As groups formed into more organized tribes, the idea of gender roles began to solidify. But in many early cultures, women may have held authority in ways that later generations forgot or rewrote. The story of prehistoric women is not loud. It does not march or declare. It murmurs beneath the surface, like water under frost. These women laid the foundations for everything that came after, yet their names are unknown, their voices unrecorded. Still, we know they were there. Carving bones. Nursing babies. Burying the dead. Watching the stars. Living, not for history, but for survival. And in that quiet survival, they shaped the world. As cities rose from stone and marble, and language was carved into tablets and etched onto scrolls, the story of women began to take clearer form. In the lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, two great civilizations emerged, Greece and Rome. Their poets sang of beauty and war. Their philosophers pondered the heavens and the soul. And their laws, arts, and customs became the foundation of Western society. Yet, the women of these civilizations often remained on the quiet edge of that grand history, observers, caretakers, muses. Their roles were shaped by custom, class, and silence. In ancient Greece, a woman's world was mostly indoors. In Athens, respectable women seldom appeared in public without a male escort. Girls were married young, often to older men, and their education focused not on rhetoric or politics but on managing the home. They learned to spin, weave, and oversee the storage of grain and oil. Their influence was felt not in the assembly, but in the rhythm of the household. Still, women played roles in religious life. Priestesses tended sacred fires and watched over temples. The Oracle of Delphi, a woman known as the Pythia, held a position of great authority, her cryptic prophecies sought by kings and generals. Her words shaped empires, even if her name has long since faded. Outside of Athens, things were different. In Sparta, women were raised to be strong and outspoken. They were educated, they trained physically, and they were encouraged to speak their minds. Spartan women could own land and manage estates. Their role was still tied to motherhood, but it was a proud, public role, raising warriors and speaking boldly. Though rarely recorded by name, Greek women composed poetry, especially in earlier eras. Sappho of Lesbos, whose verses still echo with tenderness and longing, is one of the few whose voice survived. Her words were not written for power, but for feeling, for the human heart. In Rome, women occupied a somewhat broader space in public life. A Roman woman could not vote or hold office, but she could walk freely in public, host events, own property, and influence her family's politics. Wealthy women, like Livia, wife of Augustus, or Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, held considerable power behind the scenes. Their stories are tangled in the politics of the empire, often portrayed as manipulative or dangerous by male historians. Most Roman women lived quieter lives. They tended hearths, raised children, and fulfilled religious duties. The ideal Roman matron was modest, loyal, and strong in virtue. The Vestal Virgins, elite priestesses of Rome, were symbols of both purity and civic duty. Chosen in childhood, they served for 30 years, keeping the sacred flame alive. Breaking their vow of chastity was punishable by death, buried alive, in chilling silence. Yet not all Roman women were rich or noble. Many were slaves, sold or captured from distant lands. They labored in fields and kitchens, raised other people's children, and bore hardship with quiet resilience. Their names are mostly lost, their stories buried beneath villas and roads. But they lived, laughing sometimes, weeping often, and surviving always. Through daily chores, whispered lullabies, and worn sandals, they made the grand machinery of Rome function. The women of Greece and Rome did not write the laws or lead the armies. But they were there. As mothers, midwives, priestesses, servants, and poets. They passed on culture not through declarations, but through small, steady acts. And when ruins crumble and texts are lost, it is often those quiet acts that remain, the thread of a tapestry still faintly visible, even after centuries. When the Roman Empire faded into twilight and Western Europe entered what many call the Middle Ages, women's lives continued beneath the long shadow of feudalism, faith, and survival. Between war and worship, famine and festival, they wove their quiet paths through a world ruled by kings and cardinals. For many women, life began and ended in the village. Their days were marked not by years, but by seasons, planting, harvesting, spinning, baking, and mending. The church bell called them to prayer, and the rhythm of the liturgical calendar guided daily life more than any distant ruler. Girls learned their mother's work early. They fetched water, fed chickens, and watched younger siblings. Marriages were often arranged, and life expectancy was short. Still, amid hardship, there was routine, companionship, and moments of joy, a harvest feast, the birth of a child, or a sunny afternoon at the well. In noble households, women had more to their names, land, servants, sometimes even a title. Yet their duties remained rooted in domestic and familial roles. Noblewomen managed estates when their husbands were at war. They negotiated marriages, signed contracts, and sometimes defended castles. One such woman was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a rare figure who transcended the silence of her age. Queen of both France and England, mother of Richard the Lionheart, and patron of poetry and learning, she lived boldly, ruling lands and navigating courtly intrigue in an age that asked women to be still. And then there were the women of the church, nuns, abbesses, and mystics. For some, the convent was a refuge from marriage or poverty. For others, it was a calling. Within cloistered walls, they studied, copied manuscripts, cared for the sick, and lived lives devoted to prayer. Abbesses often wielded significant power. They managed lands, supervised other women, and corresponded with bishops and kings. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century nun, was a writer, composer, and visionary. She saw visions of light and cosmic harmony, and despite being a woman, her words were preserved and respected. In the medieval imagination, women were often cast in extremes. Saints or sinners. Virgins or witches. The Virgin Mary was venerated above all, a symbol of divine femininity. But Eve, the first woman, was seen as the source of original sin, a dangerous seductress whose disobedience brought suffering. This dual view shaped much of how women were treated. Some were revered as holy, others accused of heresy or witchcraft, especially if they were healers or midwives. In times of crisis, plague, war, famine, blame often found its way to the silent woman with herbs in her satchel and secrets in her eyes. Women sang in churches, embroidered robes for priests, and offered alms to the poor. They bore sons and lost them in wars. They lit candles for peace and listened to sermons in languages they couldn't read. And they endured. Even in love, women walked a narrow path. Courtly romance was a poetic ideal, but most women married for alliance, not affection. Their desires were rarely recorded, though one can imagine that in quiet gardens and starlit corridors, hearts stirred and hands brushed against one another, unspoken. The medieval West was not kind to women, but it was not without moments of grace. Amid wars and crusades, plagues and punishments, women carved out meaning in the margins. With needle and prayer, with song and silence, they held the world together. And though most of their names are forgotten, their stitches still bind the fabric of history. As Europe slowly emerged from medieval darkness into the gentle light of the Renaissance, a subtle shift stirred across the continent. Art flourished. Cities awakened. And ideas, long slumbering under centuries of dust, bloomed again with a strange and tender urgency. In this world of domes and frescoes, books and music, women remained mostly in the background, but their shadows stretched quietly across the canvas. The Renaissance idealized beauty, intellect, and order. It celebrated human potential, but mostly, it celebrated male potential. For women, the path to recognition was narrow and lined with constraint. Still, they painted, composed, and wrote. They whispered their brilliance through the folds of convention. In wealthy Italian cities like Florence and Venice, noblewomen were often educated. They read Latin and Greek. They learned music, embroidery, and rhetoric. Their marriages were arranged, their duties prescribed, yet some found quiet rooms in which to think. One of the brightest voices of the time was Christine de Pizan, writing decades before the Renaissance fully bloomed in Italy. A widow with children to support, she wrote to earn a living, poems, allegories, and defenses of women's worth. Her Book of the City of Ladies created a dreamlike space where women were honored not for beauty or obedience, but for wisdom and virtue. Elsewhere, women made music. Maddalena Cagliana, a 16th-century composer, dared to publish her own works, writing in one preface that she hoped to show the world women were not inferior in intelligence to men. It was a quiet defiance, gently worded but deeply meaningful. In art, women were often the subject, but rarely the artist. They appeared in countless portraits, pale hands folded, eyes lowered, hair bound in braids or pearls. They were Madonnas, saints, and muses, symbols more than selves. Yet some stepped beyond the frame. Sofonisba Anguissola, a painter from Cremona, trained under Michelangelo and painted the Spanish court. Her self-portraits are subtle, intelligent, aware. She did not storm the gates, she entered politely, brush in hand. Outside the courts, most women still lived by the rules of labor and obedience. They cooked, cleaned, bore children, and supported their families. The printing press made books more available, but literacy remained limited. Education for girls was rare beyond the elite. The Church still defined the ideal woman as modest, silent, and pious. But the humanist movement, with its reverence for classical learning, quietly made room for questions. Could women reason? Could they learn? Some said yes, but carefully. In letters and salons, learned women debated love, virtue, and reason. Isabella d'Este, the First Lady of the Renaissance, corresponded with scholars and collected art. She moved through courts like a comet, graceful, witty, untouchable. Still, the Renaissance did not bring equality. For every woman praised for grace and intellect, many more were silenced or ignored. Witch hunts grew more frequent in some regions. Women with knowledge, especially of herbs, healing, or birth, were sometimes feared rather than respected. But in letters, poems, and paints, the Renaissance woman left quiet traces. She shaped culture with a whisper, not a shout, with a needle, not a sword. And while her face may gaze from canvas after canvas, it is her pen, her brush, and her mind that slowly began to reshape the world behind the scenes. Lace and law, women in the Enlightenment. The 18th century dawned with a shimmer of powdered wigs, polished manners, and glowing candlelight. The salons of Paris buzzed with laughter and debate. Pens scratched across parchment as philosophy awakened a restless Europe. It was the age of reason, of revolutions in thought, but still, women lived in the spaces between lace and law. They wore corsets and bows, but also ideas. They poured tea with one hand and held books with the other. They listened, they questioned, and occasionally, they answered back. The Enlightenment asked, what is the nature of man? Of freedom? Of rights? But rarely did it ask about women. Most philosophers, even those who advocated liberty, considered women subordinate by nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, imagined an ideal society, one in which women were modest, passive, and ruled by emotion. Yet women participated in Enlightenment culture all the same. In salons hosted by Madame Geoffrin, Madame de Staël, and Madame du Châtelet, ideas flowed freely. These gatherings were often led by women who, though excluded from universities and formal power, created intellectual havens in their drawing rooms. Émilie du Châtelet, one of the great minds of her age, translated and expanded Newton's work on physics. Fluent in Latin, mathematics, and philosophy, she collaborated with Voltaire and published her own scientific writings. But she was often remembered not for her brilliance, but for being his mistress. Elsewhere, women began to write about women. Mary Wollstonecraft, in 1792, published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In its calm, rational tone, she demanded education, reason, and dignity, not as gifts, but as rights. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, would later pen Frankenstein, another quiet revolution dressed as a Gothic tale. These were women who used the very tools of the Enlightenment, reason, clarity, logic, to critique the system that excluded them. They did not storm the Bastille. They stormed the bookshelf. But while upper-class women hosted salons and penned treatises, most women continued in familiar patterns. On farms and in shops, in kitchens and markets, they lived by candlelight and carried buckets through muddy streets. Their enlightenment came not from Rousseau or Locke, but from shared knowledge passed mother to daughter, how to stretch bread, treat fevers, calm infants, and avoid scandal. The late Enlightenment also brought revolution, first in America, then in France. Women marched in protest, stitched banners, and supported armies. In France, women stormed Versailles, demanding bread and justice. Some, like Olympe de Gouges, went further. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, insisting that liberty, equality, and fraternity must include women. For her boldness, she was guillotined in 1793. Her words, however, endured. In England and elsewhere, women began forming literary circles, lending libraries, and debating societies. Novels grew in popularity, and with them, female authors. Under pseudonyms or their own names, women wrote stories that quietly challenged norms, tales of courtship, inheritance, and quiet rebellion. Jane Austen, writing in the early 1800s, portrayed drawing rooms and dinner parties, but within them, she slipped in irony, critique, and quiet wisdom. Her heroines observed the world with sharp eyes, even when their voices were soft. The Enlightenment did not free women, but it opened the window a little. It showed them a world of ideas, even if they had to peer through lace curtains. And in salons, studies, and sitting rooms, they took their place, not loudly, but firmly, on the edge of change. Victorian Shadows, the cult of true womanhood. The 19th century unfolded like a quiet, ornamental tapestry, embroidered with lace, bound by corsets, and perfumed with restraint. In Victorian Europe and North America, the ideal woman was elevated, protected, and enclosed, like fine porcelain on a shelf. This was the era of the so-called cult of true womanhood, a phrase not shouted in the streets but whispered in sermons and stitched into etiquette manuals. A good woman, it was said, must be pious, pure, domestic, and submissive. She was the angel of the home, the guardian of morality, the heart of the hearth. For middle and upper-class women, life was lived in parlors and drawing rooms. They practiced piano, read approved novels, wrote careful letters, and hosted callers with practiced grace. Their days passed in quiet repetition, marked by tea trays and the rustle of silk skirts. But this delicate world was not universal. Working-class women labored in factories, laundries, and kitchens. They rose before dawn and returned home after dusk, often to care for large families in cramped tenements. Their hands were calloused, their backs bent, but they, too, held their homes together. Even within refinement, there was confinement. Education for girls expanded, but mostly in accomplishments, French, needlework, and music. Intellectual ambition in a woman was still seen as strange or dangerous. A woman could learn, but not too much. She could read, but not debate. In literature, women both reinforced and resisted their roles. Novels were widely read, and many were written by women, though often under male pseudonyms. The Bronte sisters, writing as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, crafted haunting tales of love, struggle, and defiance. Their heroines wandered moors, defied cruelty, and claimed independence, not with swords, but with sorrow and strength. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, George Eliot, and Louisa May Alcott all added their voices to a growing quiet chorus, each in her own way pushing the boundaries of what a woman could say and feel in print. Religion also shaped womanhood deeply during this time. Churches often emphasized women's moral superiority, her role as a spiritual guide within the home. This gave some women a quiet kind of authority, yet it also reinforced the idea that her place was private, not public. Still, some Victorian women stepped into the world. They became nurses, like Florence Nightingale, who transformed battlefield care and public health. They became missionaries, abolitionists, reformers. They organized charity bazaars, visited the poor, and wrote pamphlets on hygiene, temperance, and education. Their activism was often framed as an extension of their domestic roles, cleaning up society as they cleaned their homes. Meanwhile, colonial expansion drew women to unfamiliar lands as settlers, missionaries, or the wives of administrators. Victorian ideals followed them abroad, lace parasols shading the sun, English tea poured on distant verandas. But often, these women faced harsh climates, cultural tension, and isolation. Their diaries reveal both devotion and doubt. The strict moral codes of the Victorian era also produced repression. Sexuality was shrouded in silence. Pregnancy was a private affair. Mental health was misunderstood, often reduced to hysteria, a diagnosis frequently applied to women for everything from grief to rebellion. Behind velvet curtains and stiff bodices, many women endured loneliness, illness, and sorrow. Yet they still managed homes, raised children, and sustained the soft pulse of family life through times of war, loss, and change. Toward the century's end, the question of women's suffrage began to stir. First in whispers, then in speeches. Women asked not only to serve, but to vote. They formed groups, signed petitions, marched in long skirts, and stood in silent defiance. The world was beginning to turn. But in most parlors, change came slowly, one stitch, one sigh, one page at a time. Marching quietly, women and the Industrial Age. The Industrial Age arrived not with a trumpet, but with a hiss of steam and the grind of gears. Cities swelled, smoke rose, and the clatter of machines filled the air. As the 19th century turned, the world changed rapidly, and women marched forward, quietly but steadily, beneath its soot-darkened skies. No longer confined solely to hearth and home, women now entered the factories, mills, and shops. They rose before dawn to walk crowded cobblestone streets and stepped into long hours of repetitive labor, their hands becoming part of the machines that built the modern world. In spinning mills and garment factories, women worked 12 or 14 hours a day. Many were girls, some no older than 12. They worked for pennies, often in silence, sometimes in song, always under the gaze of supervisors and the pressure of output quotas. Their tasks were monotonous and their environments dangerous, yet their earnings, however small, helped support their families. These women, bending over bobbins and stitching seams, were essential to the new economy, even as they remained largely invisible in the ledgers of history. In the great cities, London, Manchester, New York, other women found work as seamstresses, laundresses, and shopgirls. Some became domestic servants in wealthier homes, living by strict rules and rarely having a room of their own. The distinction between working woman and lady grew sharper, yet both were bound in their own ways. Meanwhile, a different type of woman was emerging, the social reformer, clipboard in hand, walking through alleys and tenements. Women like Octavia Hill in London and Jane Addams in Chicago began documenting poverty, improving housing, and founding settlement houses to serve urban communities. Their work was driven not by fame, but by duty, a belief that women could and should improve the public world. In quieter neighborhoods, educated middle-class women began organizing clubs, reading societies, and charitable associations. They created public libraries, children's hospitals, and orphan homes. Though still shut out of formal politics, they influenced society from drawing rooms, basements, and school halls. As typewriters and telephones arrived, women entered new office roles. The typewriter girl became a symbol of modern femininity, efficient, precise, professional, yet still bound by corsets and social expectation. The world was moving faster, and women moved with it, on factory lines, behind shop counters, through smoky streets. Still, change came slowly, and the image of the perfect woman remained rooted in modesty and sacrifice. But not all women accepted this image. Some began to write, speak, and organize for change. In England, the suffragists and suffragettes rallied for the right to vote. In the United States, leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave speeches in town halls and on dusty roads, calling for full citizenship. Many women marched peacefully, some chose protest. They were arrested, force-fed, jeered at. But they persisted, marching not in anger but in quiet, determined conviction. At the same time, immigrant women arrived in droves, on ships from Ireland, Italy, Russia. They brought children, hope, and calloused hands. These women worked as cleaners, cooks, and caregivers, their dreams folded quietly between worn fabric and second-hand prayer books. Theirs was a different kind of strength, unrecorded, unnoticed, yet deeply woven into the fabric of industrial cities. They bore injustice with tired eyes and kept moving forward. By the dawn of the 20th century, women had become more visible in the public eye. Newspapers printed stories about their work, their strikes, their speeches. Laws slowly began to change. In some places, women could now vote in local elections or own property after marriage. Still, expectations remained heavy. To work was to be strong, but to marry was still the goal. To lead was suspect, but to serve was noble. The industrial age brought noise, progress, and exhaustion. And women marched through it, quietly shaping a new world, one paycheck, one petition, one stitch at a time. Votes and voices, early 20th century change. The early 20th century arrived like a hesitant sunrise, dim at first, then steadily growing brighter. The world was tired of corsets and coal smoke, hungry for movement, for change, for voice. And women, after centuries of whispers and quiet labor, began to speak more boldly, to ask, and eventually, to demand. It was not a sudden revolution. It was a slow, persistent knocking on the locked doors of law, labor, and liberty. Across Europe and North America, women's suffrage became a rallying cry. The words were simple, votes for women. But the meaning was profound. To vote meant to be heard. To count. To shape the laws that governed their lives. For decades, suffragists had petitioned and politely requested. But by the 1900s, a new generation, less patient, stepped forward. Women chained themselves to fences, marched in silent processions, and endured prison. They held signs that read, "Deeds, not words." Some went on hunger strikes. Some were beaten. In Britain, Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union made headlines with bold tactics. In America, women like Ida B. Wells, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt campaigned tirelessly, each with a different style, but all with the same quiet fire. Their victories came slowly. New Zealand had granted women the vote in 1893. Finland followed. Gradually, more nations opened the ballot box, but often with restrictions. Some allowed only white women to vote. Others limited participation by class or education. Still, momentum was growing. World War I, as devastating as it was, gave many women the opportunity to show their capability in new ways. With men at war, women stepped into factories, hospitals, farms, and even offices. They drove ambulances, managed supplies, and kept nations functioning. The image of the helpless woman was fading. After the war, women in Britain gained the vote in 1918, first for those over 30. In the United States, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. It was not the end, but a beginning. The vote had been won, but not for all women, and not equally. In many places, women of color were still excluded through discriminatory laws. In the South, Jim Crow blocked black women's votes. In the colonies, indigenous and immigrant women remained marginalized. Beyond politics, women were stepping into culture. The 1920s ushered in the age of the new woman, educated, fashionable, independent. In the cities, she wore short hair and shorter skirts, rode bicycles, danced, and drank tea alone in cafes. But the new woman wasn't new to everyone. For working-class women and women of color, independence had long been a necessity, not a choice. Writers and artists flourished. Virginia Woolf imagined a room of one's own, where a woman could write freely. Zora Neale Hurston gave voice to the black Southern woman, full of rhythm and resilience. Frida Kahlo, painting through pain, captured a uniquely female and deeply personal vision of identity and survival. In science, education, and journalism, women pushed forward. They earned degrees, traveled solo, took photographs, filed reports, ran schools, and studied stars. Still, they often did so without titles, recognition, or equal pay. Meanwhile, across much of the globe, women still lived in strict traditions. In many rural areas, marriage and motherhood remained the core of life. In factories, hours were long and wages low. In homes, women still managed invisible labor, nursing the sick, preparing meals, comforting children, mending clothes. The early 20th century was not a sudden leap, but a steady walk. Women carried their families and communities through war, economic depression, and social transformation. They stood in picket lines. They taught classrooms. They cared for wounded soldiers and sick neighbors. Their voices, once confined to parlors and pages, now echoed in courts, classrooms, and public squares. Not loud. Not boastful. But present. And though there was much still to fight for, one thing had changed forever: women were no longer merely subjects of history. They were becoming its authors. From kitchens to careers, post-war women. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent. Cities were rebuilding, and people longed for peace. The world exhaled. And as the dust of World War II slowly settled, millions of women, who had stepped into unfamiliar roles during wartime, were quietly expected to return to old ones. Back to the kitchens. Back to the laundry. Back to the cradle. But something had shifted. During the war, women had driven buses, operated radios, built airplanes, and repaired engines. They had worked in shipyards and typed orders in military offices. They had learned independence, efficiency, and courage. When peace came, many put away uniforms and tools, but the memory of ability lingered. In the 1950s, the image of the ideal housewife rose to prominence in Western media. Advertisements showed smiling women beside sparkling stoves, vacuuming rugs in heels, or waiting at the door with dinner ready. Marriage was the norm. Motherhood was expected. Obedience was idealized. This era, often remembered as tidy and tranquil, held quiet contradictions. Many women genuinely loved their homes, their families, and their roles. But others felt restless beneath the surface, unfulfilled, unseen, and silently questioning. In 1963, Betty Friedan gave voice to this quiet unease with her book The Feminine Mystique. She called it, "the problem that has no name, the soft ache of dissatisfaction so many suburban women felt." Her words resonated deeply, sparking discussion, thought, and change. Meanwhile, in classrooms and offices, women were beginning to return. More than ever before, they pursued college degrees, careers in teaching, nursing, and clerical work. Yet barriers remained. Many jobs were closed to women. Wages were unequal. And mothers faced judgment for working outside the home. At the same time, a new generation was coming of age. The 1960s and 70s brought protest, music, and change. Women marched for civil rights, against war, and for equal pay. They carried signs, wrote essays, and formed organizations. The second-wave feminist movement had begun. Women demanded access to education, control over their bodies, and protection against discrimination. They fought for reproductive rights, for childcare, and for laws that treated them as equal citizens, not dependents. Some voices were radical, others moderate. Some focused on career freedom, others on economic justice. Black, Latina, Indigenous, and Asian women spoke up too, often reminding the movement that race, class, and gender could not be separated. Legislation followed. In the United States, Title IX opened education to women. The Equal Pay Act was passed. More women entered law, medicine, journalism, and politics. They ran for office. They led organizations. They opened businesses. But many women still worked double shifts, one at their job, another at home. The expectation to be everything at once, mother, wife, worker, friend, remained strong. In the home, household tasks slowly began to be shared. Fathers changed diapers. Husbands cooked meals. But cultural change is slow, and many women still carried invisible loads, remembering birthdays, packing lunches, soothing tantrums, buying groceries, managing calendars. Even into the 1980s and 90s, magazine covers still debated, can women have it all? Outside the Western world, many women watched and waited. In developing countries, in rural regions, in places untouched by legal reform, women continued their work with less noise but no less value. They tilled fields, raised children, built communities. Their stories were often missing from headlines, but they, too, moved from kitchens to careers, sometimes in the same breath. By the end of the 20th century, women had not replaced one role with another. They had layered them, combining work and family, ambition and care, logic and love. They had not all walked the same path. But they had kept walking. A quiet reflection, why history matters. History is often told in loud voices, of kings and wars, empires and declarations. It is carved into monuments, shouted in parliaments, and marched across maps. But there is another kind of history, softer and quieter. It lives not in headlines, but in homes. Not in shouts, but in whispers. This is herstory, the story of women, woven into every field plowed, every child fed, every poem penned in the margins. It is not separate from history. It is its undercurrent, its steady thread. And though it has often been overlooked, it has never truly been absent. Across centuries and continents, women have nurtured, mended, taught, planted, healed, and built. They have ruled quietly and revolted gently. They have questioned, comforted, created. Their labor has been invisible, their pain minimized, their wisdom dismissed, and yet, they have persisted. For every queen remembered, there were thousands of unnamed midwives. For every famous feminist, there were countless silent caretakers. Herstory is not only about power, it is about presence. To remember women's history is not to rewrite the past, but to complete it. To fill in the blank pages. To listen to the silence between the official lines. It is in the letters mothers wrote but never sent. In the recipes passed hand to hand. In the lullabies that soothed generations. In the ink-stained fingers of teachers and scribes. In the quiet dignity of those who simply endured. Today, more women are recognized as leaders, thinkers, inventors, and artists than ever before. Girls study math and medicine, fly planes, write laws. They speak on world stages. But even now, echoes of the old silence remain. Bias, inequality, and expectation still weigh heavily, though more lightly than before. Herstory reminds us that progress is not a straight line. It is a patchwork of struggle and resilience, of setbacks and courage. And even now, each life lived with dignity becomes a quiet addition to that ever-growing quilt. To reflect on women's history is also to remember the value of the everyday. It asks us to look not only at the woman who gave the speech, but also the one who made the tea before she left. And as night falls, as stories drift into dreams, we are reminded that history is not just a list of events, it is a feeling. A thread of memory. A grandmother's scent, a sister's laugh, a teacher's word, a neighbor's advice. It is in footsteps across wooden floors. In the creak of a chair beside a cradle. In the soft echo of lullabies beneath a roof that never made the papers. Herstory is not just about women, it is about how we all came to be. It is about the unseen scaffolding that held us, the quiet strength that raised us, the tenderness that built nations without reward or record. To know women's history is to better understand humanity. So let us remember. Let us listen. Let us look again at the past, not to glorify, but to honor. And when we rest our heads and close our eyes, may we do so knowing that behind every quiet corner of history, a woman once stood, once dreamed, and once lived, with strength enough to shape the world.